Hi everybody, welcome along to Minibeasts to the Seashore. This is an event we're running, Clean Coast are running to commemorate Biodiversity Week, which is going on this week. And there's events happening by different organizations, or virtual events happening by different organizations all over the country. So I am joined tonight by my wonderful colleague, Susan Vickers. And so welcome along, Susan. And I really want to welcome our guest tonight, Lucy Taylor. Lucy's a marine biologist and author of the fabulous book, Ireland's Seashore, A Field Guide. Those of you who are here and don't have the book, I think myself and Susan would be in agreement here. We'd highly recommend you go out and get it. It lives in the glove box of my car, and it's just a fantastic little guide for when you're down at the beach, which I think anyone who's in this conversation are the type of people who tend to be at the coastline a bit. So the format tonight, guys, is we'll just have a brief introduction from myself and from Lucy, and then Lucy has a slideshow prepared which she's going to run through, basically going through different species groups or maybe habitat clusters or areas, and tips on IDing what you find there or differentiating similar species. At any point along the way, if you want to drop a question into the comment section down below, we'll either address it in real time or else we might catch up with it later. We're going to put aside maybe 15 or 20 minutes at the end of this webinar or chat to actually have a discussion. So if you want to save any of your questions for the end, you can put them directly to Lucy. She's confident she's going to have a 100% success rate, she told me earlier. I'm only joking. She said if there's any if there's any we're not able to address tonight, we'll definitely get back to you at another stage with any of the answers. So that's how the event is going to run. I'm really looking forward to it. Clean Coast, it's interesting, Clean Coast is not necessarily a biodiversity organization, but strangely biodiversity is woven through almost everything we do. From beach cleans to marram grass planting to some of our events that we run where we get guest speakers who invariably deal with biodiversity either directly, people like Lucy. Lucy actually was at our last roadshow, or indirectly, be they, you know, water quality scientists or something like that who are tackling water quality but having an indirect impact down the line on biodiversity. So we actually even offer small grants to local community groups. Some of them have already been drawn down, and they're still open this year for small biodiversity projects, maybe like signage or marram grass planting. So you can find more information about that on the Clean Coast website, should you or your community group be interested. That's probably enough for me from now. I might hand over to Lucy to talk a little bit about IDing and why it's a useful thing to do and an important thing to do in certain instances. And then we can get on with taking a look at some of our slides. Welcome along, Lucy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray, for having me, and to Clean Coast and Antashka. So yeah, this is the kind of event that I suppose we'd normally run at a seashore. We'd normally all be standing around in the sand, and I'd probably tell you to go away and find something and we could all have a look at it then. So it's a little bit different running it like this, and it was a bit difficult to know exactly how to go through everything. I suppose, you know, the first thing to say is that there are thousands and thousands of species that live on Irish shores between the high tide and the low tide. And there's just no way that we're going to identify all of them in something like this. And I mean, unless you have a complete encyclopedia for a brain, which I certainly don't, you're probably never, ever going to get your head around everything that you'll ever find. But for me, it's really nice to be able to identify a few things and to maybe add to that over time, just learning one or two new species every few months, or, you know, however often you get to the seashore. And I think you could get a bit too obsessed, and you could, you know, some people are really into knowing the Latin names of everything. Some people are really into categorizing things. You know, there are geneticists who can tell you what genes differ between one type of crab and the other. And I mean, I just don't have that kind of head. So I am never going to remember all of these tiny details, but there are kind of themes that will help you to tell species apart from each other. I'm really excited going to the beach and sticking my head in a rock pool, or having a look under a rock, or digging in the sand, or just walking along the tide line and seeing what's there. Because as soon as you know the name of one thing and you know what it should look like, then you realize that there's another species that you haven't seen before, or there's something different. And then you learn how many different things there are on the seashores, and you learn to look a little bit more, and maybe to kind of get a bit more familiar and love a little bit more some of the species on your local beach or on different beaches. And then in turn, I think that helps us all to care a little bit more and maybe want to conserve and look after those species a little bit. So for me, it's an important thing. I'm not expecting that you would remember everything that I say tonight unless you already know it all, which is also quite possible. We're really just skimming the surface. But hopefully it will just equip you with a few tips so that you know what to look for. Either just when you're at the beach, or if you want to take a photograph and identify something, or if you're the kind of person who'd like to share that with, I don't know, Biodiversity Ireland or one of these places who like to log wildlife. So we'll have a little look at some of the species groups. Ray and I had a bit of back and forth about what to include, and it was difficult. So he sent me some ideas and I deleted them and came up with my own. No, lots of his too. So I know recently I've been doing a species a day. Well, I've kind of slacked in the last 2 weeks, but for most of the lockdown, I was doing a species a day on our Facebook page. And one of the more popular of the species groups have been the crabs. So I have the chat box open. So if I ask questions, you're free to throw things into it as you go along. I'm not going to answer every single question, but I guess have a little think to yourself. Think, how many crabs do you know? How many different types of crabs do you think there could be on Ireland's seashores? How many have you seen? And then we'll look at this selection. So again, to yourselves, I guess you can have a look here and see how many you can recognize. If anyone wants to throw a species name into the chat box, you're very welcome if you feel like offering some identification there. So on this slide, there are 5 pictures, but 4 species of crab. The one at the top, the more reddish one, I guess, is one that we'd all be very familiar with the insides of, but perhaps not so much the shell unless you're the fishing type. So yeah, Jen's put it in, it's a brown crab. I would always call these just an edible crab or brown crab. And then below that is probably the most common one. So the guy who's kind of staring straight at us there. You'll find these all over Ireland. They come in like, you'll find them under rocks and on beaches and in all sorts of places. They've also spread around the world, and they're now a bit of a problem in some other countries. Wow. But in Ireland, they're perfectly sort of natural, and they should be there. Then on the top, beside our tasty edible crab, there's a completely different type of crab, and we'll talk a little bit about him, but the important thing to notice is his legs. And then underneath him, there are 2 crabs that are totally different colors to each other, but they're actually the same species. So I'll tell you why we know that. So the things that we need to look out for with crabs are mostly the body shell, so the carapace, that big shell, which is usually kind of oval shaped, but it can vary. In our edible crab, it's always really wide, really oval. And in other crabs, it's often more triangular. So that's one way that we can tell the edible crab apart. But one of the important things to look for is the edges of those carapace parts. So if you notice on all of these, if you look between the eyes of the crab, it varies quite a lot. So with the brown crab, it's kind of knobbly. And with the one underneath, which is our common shore crab, there are always 3 points. So it's always, he's got like a little 3-pointed helmet sticking out between his 2 eyes. And then with the one beside the brown crab, this is the velvet swimming crab, and it's got this jagged, sharp kind of ridge between the eyes. And this crab is famous for being quite aggressive, and I always think he looks aggressive. You can kind of tell him apart because he looks a bit mean. You wouldn't want to get on his bad side.
Sometimes they've got kind of red eyes, Lucy, don't they?
And they're also called red-eyed devil crabs or something like that, I think, right? Yeah, they're really evil looking things. So yeah, you're right. And then the ones below that These are Risso's crabs, and they're really flat between the eyes. So that's just one thing to look for. The other things are on the sides, you know, running from the eyes to the backs of the shells. You'll notice that it's got ridges or points or some type of shape there. And with our brown edible crab, people call it like a pie crust. So it's a little bit like the edges of a pie if you pinch them down. And, you know, he's edible and he looks like pie. I think that kind of fits. The shore crab underneath him, then, they always have these forward pointing spines. So on either side of the eyes, the shell goes really sharply forward. The velvet swimming crab, then, he's a bit similar. He also has these forward pointed spines, but again, because he's the angry guy, they're even sharper. And then the one underneath that, they point more outwards. They're not hooked. So there are loads of different types of crabs on the seashore. Those are the kind of things that you'd always look for. And if you're reading an IB book, they'll always talk about those different things. Another thing to look at is their legs. So if you look at the back legs of the velvet swimming crab, which is the angry guy, you can see that they're really flattened. And that's because this is a crab that doesn't just use his legs to walk on, he actually uses them as paddles as well, so he can swim. So there's quite a lot of different swimming crabs in Ireland, and you can always tell them apart by those flattened back legs. They're also slightly hairy, which is something that he has in common with his friends underneath him, the Risso's crab. They also have this kind of frilly fringe on their back legs. I have no idea why. I don't know what it's for, but they have it. And there's another type of crab that's very similar to those two, but it doesn't have those frilly fringes. So those are just things to look out for. So look between the eyes and on either side of the carapace, and then at the shape of the legs and whether they're flat around it and whether they have any kind of fringe or hair. I have a little test for all of you, having looked at those. I want you to see if you can tell me how many species of crab you can see in this picture. So Ray, you're free to answer, and anyone else can put an answer in the chat box if they'd like to. I'm not going to give you very long, but
I got a sneak preview of it earlier, and
I did tell you the answer.
Did you? Oh, well, I promise I didn't hear. I'm actually going to go with just one.
I didn't. Anybody want any different answers, or? 5, 2, 1. Okay, yeah. So the ones are correct. This is just one species. I actually really love this photograph, and I got really excited this day finding all these different patterns and colors. Sometimes different types of crabs can completely change color, and this goes for lots of the snails and other shells as well. I think it mostly depends on what they're eating. So these are all completely different colors, but you can see in between the eyes, there's those 3 little lumps, and on the side of the shell, the forward pointing spines. So yeah, there's a correct answer in there. They're all common shore crabs, so well done.
I have to say, I spent a significant amount of my youth, Lucy, harassing these creatures right below the
There's a lot of them down where you're from, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so fishes. I suppose there aren't that many fish that live between the high and low tide marks of a shoreline, which is the area that I usually bother animals in. There are 3 here which are fairly common. The one at the top, who looks most fishy with his nice fanned fins, is if you see a fish in a rock pool or hiding under a rock, it's probably this guy. It's probably a blenny. There are a few different types of blennies, and you can tell them apart by the patterns on their backs, the fins, and where you find them, and their size also, because a lot of them only grow to be very small. These are quite amazing because they're fish, they breathe with their gills, but they live in rock pools and really high up the shore, and they can survive out of water for a few hours. So they can just hide under a damp rock and wait for the tide to go out and come back in again and continue swimming. So yeah, they're the most common one. They're what you'll usually see. The other 2 then are also fairly standard on the seashore. The one in, is it your hands, Ray?
They're not my hands.
They're not your hands. Okay. Well, the one in the hands is a butterfish. And then the larger picture on the rock is a pipefish. And I've heard kids and things screaming on beaches going, I found an eel, I found an eel. And neither of these are really eels, but they do both look kind of eelish. And what you want to look for if you're looking at fish on the seashore is things like the fins. So you can see the one that's being held in hands has a long fin running all the way down its back. And it also has spots. So those are kind of another giveaway, the patterns on its skin.
The black spots, Lucy, isn't it, on the top of the back?
Yeah, Yeah, black spots there. The shape of the head and the face would often give away a fish as well, but in this case, they're sort of similar looking in these photos anyway. The pipefish is actually related to the seahorse. So we don't really get seahorses in Ireland very often, but we do have quite a few species of pipefish. So this is the smaller one. And you can see its little kind of snout looks a little bit like a seahorse. And these guys really don't have much of a fin. They have a tiny little fluttery fin about halfway down the back, but apart from that, nothing. So that's just something else to look for when you're looking at those.
Lucy, have you ever been bitten by a blenny?
No.
I have many times.
What are you doing to them?
Just, well, I said, yeah. Anyway, but I have just nipped on the finger multiple times
Really?
by blennies. Yeah, and they've got kind of sharp teeth.
I've never.
Yeah,
My finger
100%.
mouth. I don't know.
Yeah. Has anyone else here been nipped by a blenny in their time? Anyway.
No one's offering their stories. I think it sounds like you bother the sea life a little bit, Ray. It'd be nicer. Oh, there you go, Maria. Oh, Maria. Okay,
yes.
so
yes.
I was just going to say, I was one of Maria's MSc classmates. It wasn't me who got bitten.
Yes. I was feeling a bit like the odd one out there, so I'm glad. Yeah.
Okay. The next gang that we're going to talk about is sand dwellers. And these are things that you probably don't see alive because they live underneath the sand. But they are things that you really regularly see once their shells wash up on the shore. There are so many things that live buried in the sand, lots of worms and all sorts of things that I thought we can't really go into in too much detail. But here we have a selection of things with shells and a sandhopper. Sandhoppers, I think we're all familiar with if you've ever tried to make a sand castle, walk on a beach at nighttime. They seem to be really attracted to bonfires. They're always jumping into them if you try and have one.
Or Lucy, certainly from a clean coast perspective, anyone who's ever done a beach clean knows sandhoppers. You pick up a plastic bottle and invariably underneath it, especially on the higher shoreline, they're omnipresent.
Yeah. So there are quite a few different species of things that we would call sandhoppers. They tend to vary depending on the type of sand or the type of beach. So if you are really interested in identifying things, it's important that you also take into account the grain of what you're looking at, and also whether they seem to be living near rock pools or on rocks, or whether they are buried in the sand completely. There's been hundreds of along Prom and Lahinch. There will be, and sandhoppers are completely normal and natural. And the thing about them that I always say to people is, if we didn't have sandhoppers, our beaches would just be filthy with seaweed. And, they are the little guys eating everything out of the sand and keeping the sand clean. They're also a really important link. I mean, they're food for birds and larger things. So it's also important to have them there. They are normal and natural. So
it's interesting. Lucy, Molly just brought up Lahinch. The seaweed gets thrown up in Lahinch. And then the sandhoppers are all over, but it seems to support a huge resident population of starlings, which come down off the building. It's interesting just that this lady said it. Yeah, because you had mentioned bird food, but
Yeah. Birdie num-nums. So they're an important part. I mean, I don't think that they're the kind of animal that most of us go to the beach and see and go, wow, I want to, take this home and put it on my nature table. But they're part of it. I'm going to skip down then to the one in the bottom left, which a lot of you I'm sure know what it is, and I'm sure you found these before. It's kind of the other odd one out on this slide. So it's a type of urchin, and most urchins that we know will crawl around on rocks. They're grazers, but this guy actually, when they're alive, they're covered in, their spines look like hair, like brown hair, and they burrow into the sand. So you really rarely see them alive, but after storms, you see these shells washed up like all over some beaches. And it's amazing to think how many of them live in the sand sometimes that you're completely unaware of, and then the storm will wash them all up and you suddenly realize that they're there. They live, they're beautiful little things. I'm sure most of you know them. I always called them sea potatoes. Other people call them heart urchins. I guess it depends who your parents were. The potato. Then in between those two things, there's a little banded Venus. And so this is a bit more the typical kind of seashell that we'd like to collect. And that one I put in there just because it's quite distinctive. So it's not massively common and it's very small, but it's one of the ones that when you see it, you know what it is. Whereas the other shells on this slide, you know, it's maybe a little bit harder to tell them apart. So in the middle, we just have one species, the ray trough shells, and they look an awful lot like a lot of other things that you find on the shore. And I mean, when you first can go to a beach and you see lots of things and you think, oh, you don't know what they are. And it's not until you start to tell them apart and learn about them that you realize how many different species there are. Am I coming through okay? It says my internet connection is unstable.
You were dropping a little bit there, Lucy.
Okay.
Maybe if you just repeat just the last thing you said, but overall, I think you're okay. But yeah, we lost you there for a couple of seconds.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, so this is one of the nice reasons why it's nice to delve a little bit deeper into identifying things. So from the outside, these look really similar to other things, and what to look for with this kind of shell, the bivalves, the ones with the two sides, is to look at the shape of them, so the overall, whether it's curved or quite flat, and also to look at the point of them. So is the point right in the middle? Is it a nice triangle like that? Or does it curve off to one side? So those are just things to look at. That point in most identification books is called a beak. So it'll tell you whether the beak points in a certain direction or not. The other thing that's really important is to look at the inside of these shells, because on the inside where the animal was, the animal that lives in there will stick to the inside of this shell and it leaves a scar. So I forever forget which scar belongs to which animal. But if I'm trying to figure out, is this something or anything, I always know to try and take a picture of the inside as well as the outside, so that you know when you get home you can compare the inside to other photographs and to other species. So you can see that in this one there's kind of a circle, which is where the main muscle would have been attached to, and then there's like a gill line around the outside, and then it's completely white. And that'll be really standard across all the animals of the species. So on the right, again, if people follow the Facebook page, you'll have seen these pictures recently, because the two photos there with 3 shells in it, so 3 that we're looking on the outside and then 3 that we're looking on the inside. And from the outside, they look really similar, but this is actually 2 different species. So it's 2 smooth Venuses and 1 northern Lucina. And there is a slight difference in the beak. You can see that the smooth Venus that there are 2 of, they kind of twist a little bit more. And the northern Lucina is maybe slightly straighter. But on the inside, they're really, really different. So if you look down in the very bottom corner, if you can see it, northern Lucina always have this really strong stripe through the middle of the shell. And it's always straight and it's always really distinctive. So straight away, if you're not sure, you can always tell that that's what it is. Whereas the other guys kind of have a shape, I think it's a little bit like a Pac-Man or something. It's sort of nom-nom, you know, you can kind of see its little mouth. So they're just little ways to remember things, and just to note that it's always worth looking at the inside as well as the outside. Ray?
Lucy, in general, are these, you call them bivalves, is there a kind of a colloquial name for these? Like in my head, I'm thinking clam. Is there, you know, are these all different types of clams, or is that an unhelpful term in terms of, yeah?
I never really use the word clam very often, but yeah, I guess they are. I mean, there are lots of names, some groups of them. I mean, mussels are bivalves, and there's lots of mussels. Scallops are bivalves, there's lots of scallops. So yeah, I guess they are clams. They're things that...
Yeah, no, you can just say it. Clams is a useless name.
Yeah, I don't know. I never used it, but yeah. And to most people, they're just seashells. So yeah. So here's another trick one. So this is in the living in the sand section, and I just was interested to see, has anyone seen one of these? Do you know what it is? And it's obviously not a bivalve. So free to answer, Ray or anyone else. Very stumped.
No. Well, to me, it seems obvious, but then it's almost too like, to me it looks like a small spider crab, but then I'm sure it's probably not.
No, Libby has it right there. So it's a masked crab. Yeah. So these guys, I thought this was just nice. They live in the sand. So again, you don't really see them most of the time unless there's been a storm and they've all been washed up. They have these really, really long front arms. There should be 2. This guy's obviously dead and he lost one. But the reason that they're called masked crabs as well is if you look at the pattern on their back. So you can see they've got very distinctive spines, like we talked about earlier, very tiny space between the eyes. But some people can see a face in the back of them. So yeah, you can That's why they're called masked crabs, so that it looks like a mask. Molly, hermit crab. Hermit crabs have those really, really long. Yeah, it could be, but no, they're not. They're much bigger than a hermit crab. So yeah.
So
crabs.
what size would these be, Lucy? Maybe like half a fist size, or?
Yeah, I'm thinking
right.
palm-sized for the main body.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Good, I've never seen.
I actually don't know. I haven't seen them much bigger than that, but yeah,
very good.
That's what I'd be used to.
Mm-hmm.
So then, the stuck to the rock section. So yeah, those are all kind of things that move around, whereas these guys tend to stay quite still. I better check the time. I'm waffling a little bit, not too much. So these are like just the most typical things on every seashore that you'll see, and I'm sure you all know that the main picture is mostly barnacles with some limpets and some mussels, and then the panel down the side is limpets. These are, so barnacles and limpets, there are actually quite a few species in Ireland. There are definitely 3 of each that are very common, but they're not easy to tell apart. And so for those people who are really interested, you can learn about the different shapes. So the barnacles have plates on the side and you can count them. The center part can be round or it can be shaped like a kite. You can look for all of those things, but really, I mean, I don't know. And you can get down to the detail of, in this picture, you can see some of them are slightly open and the flesh is bright blue on some of them, and on others it isn't. But I mean, they're tiny, these things, you know, they're really, really, really small. So going down to your seashore with a microscope is not going to happen. And even a magnifying glass, it's kind of, I don't know. If you want to, those are the ways to identify them. But another way to identify a lot of these things is that they tend to live in different parts of the shore. So you can kind of assume that if you're really low down shore, the area where it's one type of barnacle. And you can kind of assume that at the high shore, where there's hardly water, it's another type. So those are also things to look for. And I just wanted to mention that.
Just to be clear in this photo, Lucy, what's what? Well, you mentioned 3 species: mussels, barnacles, and limpets. Which is which, and what's the easiest way to tell?
Okay, so there's mussels, barnacles, and limpets. So yeah, the mussels are tiny. These are just tiny seed mussels. So they're all the black things stuck to the rocks. Mm-hmm. There's one limpet in the middle, and the limpets are also on the side photo. So those are limpets. And then the barnacles are all of the other little things stuck to the rocks. And yeah, there are definitely 2 different types of barnacle that I can see in that photo. But for most people, that's going a little bit deep into it.
And barnacles to me always would have looked like limpets, but I believe they're actually not related or not closely related at all. Is that true?
Not at all. So limpets are related to the snails and all those things, and barnacles, as you said the other day, Ray, when we were talking, are related to crabs. So barnacles, what happens is barnacles spawn into the water, and so the tiny little barnacles become plankton, and then at some point they decide to settle onto a rock, and what they actually do is they stick their head onto the rock and they build this shell around them, and that's them. They don't go anywhere forever. That's them stuck to the rock. Right. They open up a tiny bit and out come their legs, and they just catch things that flow past them in the water and pull their legs back in, and that's what they eat.
Probably a good thing for people to Google afterwards is barnacle feeding, because it's pretty fascinating. Sorry to interrupt.
The limpets then, they move around. So they have a spot where they like to live, but they move off, they graze on the rock. So they have these really sharp teeth. If you're a complete nerd like me, you can actually hear them. If you like to sit in rock pools and listen, you'll hear them rasping at the rock. You can also sometimes see the scars they leave. So yeah, they're very different species. And yeah, within that then there are a few different ones that can be tricky to tell apart, but
I am a little conscious of time that Lucy, that we have enough time to give people 10 or 15 minutes just at the end to ask any questions.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This is one then that you suggested including, Ray, so people might have seen this in their seashores locally, and it's people walk on it because it crunches and they like that, but you actually really shouldn't walk on it. So these are the houses of the honeycomb worm. So these, again, they stick themselves to rocks and they create these lovely structures. And inside each one of those holes will be a worm, and it lives. It'll stay inside until the tide comes in, and then when the tide, until the tide comes in, and then when they're covered in water, they'll come out and feed in the water. There's really nothing you can confuse this with. It's just a really nice thing to be able to identify. And it's something that's being monitored quite closely in Ireland because these honeycomb worms are more of a southern species. They really like warm waters, not like tropical, but just slightly warmer. And so people are monitoring where they're able to survive. And it's thought that they're moving north a fair bit. So as our waters warm slightly.
I'd be interested to know in the comment section who and where has actually seen these. I certainly see them out west in Clare, but I'm not sure about this.
This photo is from County Cork, but yeah. These then, we're getting back to our kind of shells that you might like to collect section. Hegarty's in Clare, yeah. So Clare is another one. So these are some of our common snails. And I don't know, Ray, you didn't really want to include snails, but I really like these guys.
I did not want to include them. They just seemed like so difficult to tell apart.
So there's no honeycomb worm on Irish man. Okay, interesting. So these are some of our more common groups of snails. We have so many different types of them, and they can be really hard to tell apart. So the main three groups of snails that we have are our periwinkles, so our winkles, our whelks, and our top shells. And they're quite different in the way that they live and what they eat and all of that, but sometimes they look quite similar. So this slide, if you look at it, all along the top, you have 4 species, and along the bottom, you have the same 4 species. So starting at the top left, in that photo, there are 2 snails, but they're actually 2 different species. So the one on the furthest left is our edible periwinkle. So I guess everyone's very familiar with the concept of a periwinkle, and that's what it looks like. Very similar looking to it then, but is actually a top shell. So these are very separate species. And if you look down from those 2 then, below it, you'll see the underside of the periwinkle and the underside of the top shell. The honeycomb. And so the things to look out for to separate a lot of snails is, even if they look the same from the top, because they can get covered in seaweed and they can be strange colors, if you turn, you look at the holes, so you can see that the periwinkle there has only a tiny band of white, and the top shell has a much broader band of white, and it's much flatter underneath. You possibly can't see, but the top shell there also has a little bump sticking out from the top, which is, they refer to it as, it just is there on all of them. I have no idea why, but it's a handy way.
Sorry, would you just repeat that, Lucy? We just, maybe I just lost you. There's a bump on the top of the top shell that's not evident on the periwinkle, is it?
Yeah, so that's just in the toothed top shell, just this one species. I don't know why it's there, but it's there, and it's a handy way of identifying it. Then the middle section, so this is just one species. This is a different type of top shell, and this is a lot more common for all of your top shells. So this is kind of more standard, that it's got these purpley streaks. So a lot of the different types of top shells have that. And if you flip them up underneath, you'll notice in most top shells that they have the main hole where the snail comes in and out, but they also have a tiny little belly button beside that. So there's a tiny little hole that you don't see in periwinkles and you don't see in whelks. If I had a teacher pointer, I'd point you at the hole, but it's right bang slap in the middle of on the bottom. Cool. And then you'll see, if you look at the one on the far right, it also has this tiny belly button hole beside where the snail is. And this is,
what's the function of that, Lucy?
it's the way the shell is, the way the shell is constructed. Yeah, I don't know. Some of them are hollow the whole way up. I'm not sure. It's just there. I don't know that there's a function to any of these things, but they're there. So the thing that these guys all have in common, the periwinkles and the top shells, is that these ones on your screen are all grazers. So they'll just eat whatever they find on the rocks. They'll scrape away and eat any bits of algae or detritus that they find. Whereas the next one, I've clicked on something funny and the slides aren't moving. Yeah. These are whelks. And these are different because these guys are predators, they're carnivorous. So the main picture is of dog whelks. And you can see that they vary in color. There's lots of different patterns on their shell, but they're all the same shape. So you really need to look that they're very bulbous and then pointy. So looking at the shape of that is really important. And in a lot of ID books, they'll talk about the number of whirls. So the number of times the shell spins around can also tell you which is which. The smaller picture then is of a netted dog whelk. So similar, it's also a predator, but they look quite different, but they're more closely related. One way of telling whelks from all of the other shells is that if you look at the hole where the snail is, it also has what's called a siphon canal. There's a small canal that comes all the way out the back. And the reason, this one does have a reason, that these whelks, because they're predators, all whelks are predators, they have a kind of a sensory organ that sticks up out. So when they're crawling along under the water, this will stick up out there and they'll be sniffing in the air, trying to detect chemicals that are associated with their prey, so they'll know where to go to find something to eat. And just to say again, in the larger picture, all of those tiny little yellowish capsules, those are dog whelk eggs, and it's quite unusual. It's not unusual. No, there are two different ways for these kinds of animals to reproduce. One is just to broadcast into the water, and the other one is to lay eggs. So it's nice to find these. You know then that they're in the area, and you might have seen them under rocks and things. Here, question, is this a useful photograph for identifying a sea snail? And does anyone know what these are?
See them all the time, but I would have no idea what the name is.
Yeah. So these are
yellow fellas.
Little yellow fellas. Sometimes they're red, sometimes they're green. But they're all the same. They're flat periwinkles. And someone calls them sweet corn. Yeah, exactly. They're like sweet corn. So they're all flat periwinkles, but there are actually two species of flat periwinkle. And so this photo doesn't actually tell us which one is which, because one of them eats one type of seaweed and lives in one place on the shore, and another one lives in a different place on the shore and eats a different type of seaweed. So without seeing what kind of seaweed they're eating, you can't really tell. But for most people, it's enough to know that they're a flat periwinkle. For geneticists, they'll kill them, do a genetic study, and they'll tell you which one it is. Most of them are going to go to tell. So then, my favorite rock pools, and I've run out of time. So, sea urchins. I'll go through this quickly. So here on this slide, there's three different types of sea anemones, sorry. The one on the top left, you've got a red one and an orangey one, and they're the same species, and you can tell that because the tentacles are kind of similar lengths and they're arranged in a similar way. This is our beadlet anemone, so it's one of the most common ones. And when the tide goes out, they can pull their tentacles in, and that green guy in the top is exactly the same species, to the best of my knowledge. He just has his tentacles all wrapped in. So you'll see them on the seashore when the tide is out looking like that. And they can vary hugely in color, but they're the same. The one underneath that then, all wrapped up with the white lines going down it, these are, some people call them whartlet anemones. I think gem anemones is nicer. That's another name for them. And they're similar in that they can wrap up their tentacles like this. And when they're open, they look completely different. The little inset picture shows you they're very well camouflaged. What makes some of them different then is this one on the right, which is a snake-locks anemone, which is amazing and has these otherworldly colors and really long tentacles. So you can instantly tell what it is. And when the tide goes out, it can't retract those tentacles. So it just looks like this sad blob of melted goo. Which is not very nice. But that's a really handy way of knowing different species of anemone, is whether they curl up or whether they don't.
They must be one of the most beautiful things in the Irish shoreline, Lucy.
I know.
Just when you see them in the water, they're stunning.
I know.
Guys, just while Lucy's finishing up, if you could just add to the comment section, what are some of the most fascinating, different, or interesting creatures you've found on the Irish seashore? And we might get around to talking about it once Lucy's finished with the slides.
Yeah. So knowing what I just told you, does anyone know what species this is? No offers?
Thinking one or two, number one or number two.
Yeah. So this is another case where For years, this was part of number one. They just called it a beadlet anemone as well. But with the scientific techniques that we have now, exactly, Libby's right, it's a strawberry anemone. So now they've made this a separate species because from the outside it looks kind of similar, but being able to analyze its DNA, we now know that it's different. So even when you visually look at a species, you sometimes can't tell exactly what it is. It's another case of that. So then I just put these two in as well because they sometimes live in rock pools, and I thought they're nice. These are our two most common starfish. The one with the proper starfishy arms is our common starfish, and then the small one is the cushion star, and I just think people like them, so I thought I'd put it in. And then the final slide is just these odds and ends. So I think a lot of you will have found all of these kinds of things, probably during beach cleans, you see them in the news. So offers, tell me what can you see here, and we'll see if, I'm sure people can identify most of them. When its tentacles are out, does it look like the beadlet? Oh yes, Molly, it does. But you can still see that the stalk has those green dots on it. So you know it's a strawberry one. That's in reference to the anemones. So what can people see? Portuguese man of war, yes. Blue-rayed limpets. Libby's on fire, she gets all of them.
If Libby's a professional, it's cheating though.
If Libby's a professional, she's pretty bored. Perfect. Yeah.
Could I speculate, Lucy, that it would be difficult to tell the mermaid's purse in terms of species, given the picture?
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah. So someone has put that it's a dogfish egg sac, which is pretty much correct. Although I think technically they're catfish, but this is it's the most common mermaid's purse. So for anyone who doesn't know, the bottom right picture, the little kind of sac with the frilly tendrils, that's almost every beach you go to, you'll be able to find them. They are very easy to identify because of these frilly curly bits at the end. They're also quite small. There's one other species that's similar, but not that similar. Where it gets more difficult is with rays. So not ray you, but flat sharks. Their egg cases can be difficult to tell apart. But again, you would look at the shape of the things sticking off either end. And that would be the main way that you'd tell it, and sometimes the size just. So everyone's got almost everything else. So in the big picture there, you can see the big blown up balloon is the Portuguese man of war. Slightly in front of it by the winds there. Most people think of these as jellyfish, which kind of are colonial. So they're not actually a single animal. They're colonies of tiny little animals all living together. And they just and sting people. Then the one at the top, someone got it as well. Someone said a blue-rayed limpet. So again, related to the limpets that we see on the rocks, but they live on kelp only. So you just see them eating kelp, and you sometimes find seaweed washed up with the shape of them in it.
They live right down the bottom, Lucy, don't they? Of the front.
Not always, no.
Yeah,
not
right.
always. You find them on the front as well. Yeah.
So I didn't actually see the answer, or see. I don't. I'm the center one on the right, the middle one between the mermaid's purse and the blue-rayed limpet.
I haven't seen that either.
What is it? Have we got an answer for it yet?
Yeah, I haven't got an answer from here. So this is I've forgotten the name. A saddle. What are the things that do this?
Not a clam.
Not a clam. Not a clam, but delicious scallop. So no, not a limpet. So no, it is. It's a type of scallop. Sorry. So they live attached to the rocks. So the top part of them looks like your typical seashell, but the bottom part, saddle oyster. That's it. Jeepers. I couldn't remember. Thank you, Maria. We have these. So Maria's my housemate. We have them on the windowsill. I had a brain blank. The top part looks like your typical oyster, and underneath it's molded into the rock. So they become all these weird and wonderful shells. And then they always have this large hole because they attach to the rock using byssus threads, and that's where these byssus threads come out. But they're beautiful. They're really shiny, and if you find one, you'll always want to take it home with you.
Mussels attached to the rocks with these type of threads as well, Lucy. Are they both stationary once they've attached? They're there for life, or can they move?
I've heard that mussels can sometimes detach and go to other places if they feel like it, but I don't know about that. So I don't know if anyone's really tracked mussels and studied where they are. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So that's it. That's all that I have. Those are my bits and bobs to finish up with.
Fantastic. Well, that was really interesting. I learned loads from it. I've probably got loads of questions. I wonder, Susan, was there anything interesting or any interesting questions in the comment section?
No, but I think that the level of engagement has been really good, and I think, Lucy, that was super. And it's often really difficult to do something virtually, but you did it really well. But I think what's shown is that a lot of people on this Zoom call actually know quite a lot of they know quite a lot. So well done to everybody. If anyone has any questions, fire away. There's no questions at the moment.
Lucy,
I don't.
Size-wise, skate, those large flat sharks, are also born in mermaid purses. What size? I don't think I've seen a skate mermaid purse. Is that way bigger, or?
Yeah, so there's a few different types. I think the biggest ones would be about kind of 10 centimeters. I mean, I've definitely found ones that would cover my hand if I were to pick one up.
Right.
So they're quite big. The problem with them, with identifying them by size, is that when you see them on the seashore, they're often dried out, those mermaids' purses, and so they get quite small.
Gotcha.
And so often they'll tell you to soak it before you try and decide what species it is. So to put it back in water. Zoe wants to know why the man of war is called that. I don't know.
Molly
For
has
stinging.
Lucy.
I think because, is the Portuguese man of war not a type of ship or something? And it also comes across the top of the water and does nasty things? I'm not sure. But yes. So.
Lucy, there's lots of questions flying in now.
An unusual jelly-like sac about the size of a coin with a bit of blue in the middle. Any ideas? An unusual jelly-like sac. I'd love if I could see a photograph.
You know, I think I have it in my head. It's kind of hangs off the rock, real limp looking. In my head, it's kind of yellow, yellow, almost like the color of your cardigan there. I kind of have something in my head like that. No.
That's, I don't know. I'd like to see a picture. There are different, so similar to the Portuguese man of war and the by the wind sailor, there are a few other kinds of animals like that. But I don't know exactly what that one
I'll see if we can find something. We'll look it up and we'll post it on social media maybe tomorrow. If we
and if so, this is from Mark. Mark, if I don't know if you look at our Facebook page, but if you wanted to go to Shore Life of Ireland on Facebook and send a picture, then I can have a look at it and we can have a chat. Which is what they did. The couple there from Simon's iPad. We had a chat last week about something that they found in the sand. So.
What's that Facebook page again, Lucy? Will you remind us? It's an excellent page and you kind of update it quite regularly.
Shore Life of Ireland.
Shore Life of Ireland.
Yeah.
Lucy, there's a question that came in before Zoe's, which was from Molly, that she thinks she found a sea gooseberry with coloured sides like phosphorescence. Is this a thing? And she found it in Clifton. Do you see that?
Oh yes. Oh, that's a comb jelly. So you'll often see, if anyone likes snorkeling, or whoever, I think it was Libby who's the diver, you'll know these because they just float in the water and you don't really see them until you're in the water. But in the middle of summer they'll be everywhere, so if you put on a mask and snorkel you'll often see them, and they're kind of egg-shaped but almost completely see-through, solid jelly, and running all down the sides of them they have these little disco lights. So it sounds like it might have been something like that. Yeah, we've always called them comb jellies. And they're similar. They're colonial as far as I know as well, so made up of lots of different animals, I think. Yeah.
Lucy, is it possible, friends of mine said they've done so, is it possible to find octopus on the Irish shoreline in rock pools?
Yeah. I mean, it's not common in a rock pool.
Yeah.
We have octopuses, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah. And the other things, I mean, I didn't put a cuttlefish bone in there, but they're very common to find washed up on the shore. We have a lot of cuttlefish, which would be similar. Yeah, and I don't know any kids there who've ever put a hook in the water and caught a squid and got squirted at. That happens too. But yeah, we have those things.
Is there?
Just shame that you can't share photos. I'd love to see everyone's pictures of what they found. But
I think if tonight proves anything, it's you could do one of these talks on any one group or any one.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
Like, you know,
yeah.
Is there species, Lucy? I think we talked about this yesterday, that would indicate certain things about. I know you said some species like it high in the shoreline and some low, etc. But is there species, maybe some of the ones we've covered tonight, that would indicate really clean water or maybe a tolerance for dirty water? Do things jump to mind?
Yeah, I mean, usually what you'd notice then on the shore, again, we've spoken about this before, right, is the algae. So again, I didn't put any seaweeds in tonight, but you'd notice an awful lot of the bright green algae. If you see only them and nothing else, you might suspect the water's polluted with either human sewage or agricultural runoff. So they're very normal. It's very normal to find those bright green algae, but if you see large stretches of only that would be bad. And in general, a lot of these things will keep the water clean. So if you see a nice variety of seaweeds and lots of these animals that filter feed, you know, that wave in the water and catch bits, they'll be keeping the water clean. So they're good to have. And if the water is very dirty, they mightn't be able to survive. So in general, you'll know a place isn't that clean if you don't see very much there. Saying that, you will all be familiar with those kind of muddy river estuary places, and often the majority of life in those places is under the sand. It's rays or fish and things that live buried in the sand. So yeah, you mightn't always see it either, but you'll see the shells. Someone has a question then about bright orange sponge, which is really common, and sometimes is orange and sometimes is green. It came in from Mark there. So I think it depends, some of those sponges. So if you know what sponges are, they'll grow completely covering rocks, like a layer of gunky, blobby stuff on the rock, and they can be covering large areas. And some of them are a little bit like tropical corals, that they take algae into their cells to give them extra food, which is where corals get their nice bright colors, and where some of the snake locks, anemones get their nice bright colors from as well. So people sometimes say, and I don't think it's exactly proven, but you'll see different colors of sponge on rocks depending on whether they live in a shady area where those algae aren't living in them, or if they live in the sunshine where the algae does live in their cells, because those algae are plants, so they need to photosynthesize from the sun. So if they live in a place where there's no sun, they won't have those, they won't be green.
That's totally fascinating. So are sponges a species group? I can't speak in the scientific terms themselves. Lucy, what is a sponge? I'm familiar with them, those orange squishy things that are on the rocks, but what are they?
Sponges, what are sponges scientifically? I mean, yeah, they are a group. I'm trying to think. I always associate them in my mind with sea squirts, but they are completely separate to sea squirts. They kind of the same places and are quite similar, but no, they're completely different. So yeah, sponges are a little group.
Anomaly.
And I mean, you'll find there's a huge range of them around the world. Like that's what we have in Ireland, is those orange or green blobby coatings on rocks. But you know, in the tropics, they might be massive, and they might have calcium in them, and you know, the leftovers from those sponges is what we use as sponges. So yeah, there's a lot of variety, not that many in Ireland. So
just a quick question, with climate change, what kind of differences do you think, now broadly, do you think we'll start seeing on Irish coastlines?
So Ireland is kind of an interesting position because of the Gulf Stream. So we're very far north in the world. It always amazes me when I look at a globe how far up we are. But our waters aren't that cold because of the currents coming through the Atlantic. So we get a real mix of species. So we have, in Ireland, you'll have species that live up in the Arctic and all the way down to Ireland. But we also have species that you'll find in the Canaries, in the Mediterranean, and up here. So there's kind of a crossover where we are. we're right in the middle. So I suppose we are not likely to see lots of things going extinct with climate change in Ireland. But what we might find is that the number and the variety of species goes down slightly as waters get, if they get warmer, if that's what will happen, then those species will move north and we won't get the Arctic ones as much. We'll just have the more southern ones. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we're going to, there probably won't be any fewer things living on the beach, but there might fewer different species living on our beaches. Mm-hmm. So like I said, that honeycomb worm, that's one thing that people are tracking to see, is it moving and can they tell anything about climate change because of that? So, yeah.
There's a question there in from Jess.
A mussel-like thing without a shell, dark red and blobby-like. Was it stuck to a rock, Jess? Or Jake?
That's a yes, that's a yes. Thumbs up for yes.
Okay, so it could have been a type of sea squirt because sometimes they're red. So sea squirts will stick to the rock. They're sort of usually oval. They'll stick with one end and they have two siphons. So they literally just pull water in and spit it out again and filter it as it goes through their bodies. Usually they're kind of see-through or browny kind of colored, but sometimes they're red. So it might have been that. Again, if you want to send me a photograph, that's off the top of my head, but without images, it's kind of hard to know. Yeah.
Right. I'm conscious that we said we'd go from 7 to 8 and people probably have dinner and stuff ready. Lucy, I really enjoyed it. I feel I'd love to do another one and dive into another section. You know, it's clear from tonight that there's a lot of interest and there's so much to talk about, almost an infinite amount of things to talk about it. Thanks so much for coming along. Guys, if anyone wants to find more details, Lucy has already given the details of her Facebook page, and she's on Twitter as Luck Buttons, Loose Buttons,
yeah. Loose Buttons. Tagged in all of the posts for this, so I'm sure you'll. You know. Oh, there's a shell coming in. Someone has a scallop.
Yeah, we'll have to do
that's
another.
Huge.
I want to thank everyone for coming along, guys. Hopefully the next one of these we do is on a real beach all together again.
It'll be lovely.
But yeah, thanks a million for coming along, everyone. If there's any questions we didn't answer, leave it in the comment section. And over the next couple of days, we'll post on social media about it or something. So
for sure.
I think we're going to record this, or we have been recording it, so it will be up online on Clean Coast. And if Lucy wants it for her Facebook page, absolutely, so people can watch it.
Maybe not. It's testing for my brain to think about all these different things in the one go. But if there's any topics that anyone would like any more of these kinds of things as well, let us know, and sure. We'll have a think about it. So yeah, love to see all the little faces.
Yeah, absolutely. See you guys.
Bye. Thank you, Zoe. It was lovely to have you. Cheers. Skates and hoodies. Okay.